At my husband's will reading, my son sneered. "You're just a useless old woman, Mom. What would you even do with a real inheritance?" Dad knew that. I clutched the garage key, hiding my smile. Those words echoed in my mind 3 hours later as I stood in the middle of an abandoned industrial district, staring at a dilapidated garage with peeling paint and rusted locks. My son Jonathan had just thrown me out of what I thought was my home, the penthouse Robert and I had shared for 15 years, with nothing but a suitcase, and this mysterious key our family attorney had handed me after reading Robert's will. To my beloved wife, Susan Campbell, I leave the property located at 1420 Industrial Parkway, the garage and its contents. A garage. After 42 years of marriage, my husband had left me a garage while giving our son a multi-million-dollar penthouse and investment portfolio. The humiliation had been crushing, watching Jonathan's face transform from fake concern to barely concealed triumph as he realized he'd inherited what appeared to be everything of value. But as I fumbled with the unfamiliar key in the darkness, something Robert had whispered to me during his final weeks came flooding back. "Promise me you'll only use this if you absolutely have to. But if that day comes, Susan, don't hesitate." I'd assumed he was talking about his medication, about end-of-life decisions. Now, standing before this mysterious garage, I wondered if he'd meant something entirely different. The ancient lock clicked open with surprising ease. I pushed the heavy door aside and stepped into absolute darkness, my phone's flashlight cutting through decades of accumulated shadows. What I saw made me freeze in place, my breath catching in my throat. 3 vehicles sat arranged with museum-like precision, each covered by custom-fitted cloth covers. But it was the unmistakable silver grille visible beneath the front cover that stopped my heart. The distinctive profile of what appeared to be a vintage Aston Martin, its polished chrome catching my phone's light like a beacon. With trembling fingers, I pulled away the first cover. A pristine 1964 DB5 in silver birch emerged, identical to the one Sean Connery drove in those James Bond films Robert had loved obsessively. The car gleamed as if it had just rolled off a factory floor, not as if it had been sitting forgotten in an industrial garage. "Robert," I whispered into the silence, "what on earth were you planning?" The second cover revealed a 1956 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing, its distinctive doors and elegant lines unmistakable even to my untrained eye. The deep blue paintwork was flawless, every chrome detail perfect. The third car was a 1967 Ferrari 275 GTB4, its deep red color rich and lustrous under my phone's light. Each vehicle was accompanied by a leather portfolio containing documentation, maintenance records, and what appeared to be certificates of authenticity. I wasn't a car expert, but even I knew these weren't just vintage automobiles. These were automotive treasures of extraordinary rarity. Then I noticed the envelope taped to the wall beside a light switch, my name written in Robert's unmistakable handwriting. My hands shook as I found the switch and flooded the space with unexpected LED brilliance, revealing that this wasn't some abandoned garage, but a professionally finished automotive sanctuary with climate control, security systems, and specialized storage. The letter inside was several pages long, written on Robert's personal stationery. "My dearest Susan, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've discovered what I've come to think of as my final gift to you. The secrecy wasn't meant to hurt you, but to protect what I was building for your future. 6 years ago, when I received my heart failure diagnosis, I knew our time was limited. I needed to ensure you would be protected after I was gone. I sank onto a leather bench positioned against one wall, my mind reeling. Robert's diagnosis had been devastating, but he'd always insisted he had years left. I'd never imagined he'd been planning for this moment from the very beginning. I know you're wondering about the will, about why I would leave our home to Jonathan instead of to you. This decision caused me sleepless nights, but I've watched our son change over the past decade. The ambitious boy we raised has become calculating, dismissive of anything he doesn't see as immediately valuable. I feared what would happen if I left everything to both of you jointly. Jonathan would have found ways to control your portion for your benefit, as he would say. Tears blurred my vision as I continued reading. Robert had seen interactions I'd made excuses for, dismissive comments I'd rationalized away. Jonathan has received what he will see as the valuable inheritance, the penthouse, the visible investments, the status symbols. But what you're looking at now, my love, is the real wealth. These 3 cars alone are worth approximately $12 million, but they're just the beginning. $12 million. I looked up at the 3 silent machines, their perfect surfaces reflecting the overhead lights. The number seemed impossible. In the safe behind our Venice photograph, combination is our anniversary date. You'll find documentation for investment properties I've acquired, all transferring to your name upon my death. Banking information for accounts that will provide comfortable income for the rest of your life, and the deed to a cottage in Carmel we visited several years ago, fully furnished and ready for occupancy. The safe opened easily when I entered our anniversary date. Inside, I found thick portfolios documenting apartment buildings in Seattle, commercial properties in Chicago, a vineyard in Northern California, and investment accounts that made my head spin. The total asset inventory at the bottom of the page showed numbers that seemed surreal. Robert's letter continued. I wanted to give Jonathan a chance to show his true character. If he proved himself worthy, you might choose to share some of this wealth with him. But if he revealed a different nature, this legacy is your protection, your independence, your freedom from anyone's judgment, including his. As I sat in that garage surrounded by millions of dollars in automotive art and evidence of Robert's extraordinary planning, the irony was overwhelming. Hours earlier, my son had dismissed me as a useless old woman while believing he'd inherited everything of value. He'd literally thrown me out of my home, confident that I was now dependent on his charity. How spectacularly wrong he had been about everything. I spent that first night in a small office space I discovered adjacent to the garage, complete with a bathroom, kitchenette, and even changes of clothes in my size. Robert had anticipated I might need temporary shelter here. As dawn broke through the industrial district's grimy windows, I wasn't just planning my next move. I was methodically preparing for war. My first call was to Marcus Weatherby, the automotive specialist whose contact information Robert had included. Despite the early hour, he answered immediately with a crisp British accent. Mrs. Campbell, I've been expecting your call. First, please accept my condolences. Robert was not just a client, but a friend. Within 2 hours, Marcus had arrived at the garage, a distinguished man in his 60s who moved with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to handling extraordinary assets. Your husband began acquiring these vehicles 6 years ago, he explained, opening his leather portfolio. Each purchase was exhaustively researched for authenticity, provenance, and investment potential. He was building something remarkable. As Marcus walked me through the documentation, I began to understand the scope of Robert's strategy. The DB5 alone was worth $4 million, authenticated as one of only 1,059 ever produced. The Mercedes Gullwing was valued at $3 million, with a documented racing history that made it exceptionally rare. The Ferrari, with its matching numbers and complete service records, was appraised at $4 million. Nawator. Currently, the collection is worth $12 million, Marcus confirmed, but values have been appreciating consistently. These particular models are considered blue-chip investments in the collector car world. More importantly, Marcus had been working with Robert on something else, a comprehensive plan for my financial independence that went far beyond the cars. Robert introduced me to Patricia Winters, an estate attorney specializing in complex trust structures. She's been expecting your call as well. By noon, I was sitting in Patricia's downtown office, a striking woman in her 50s with the kind of sharp intelligence that commanded immediate respect. "Your husband created an extraordinary protection plan," she said, reviewing the documents I'd brought. "The trust structures are impeccable. The asset transfers seamless. Everything is designed to ensure your complete independence." What I discovered over the next several hours fundamentally changed how I saw my situation. The Carmel Cottage wasn't just a refuge, it was a $2 million property in one of California's most desirable locations, fully renovated to my exact preferences based on photos Robert had taken of our city home. The investment properties generated $47,000 monthly in rental income. The stock and bond portfolios were conservatively managed but substantial, designed for stability rather than aggressive growth. "Most importantly," Patricia explained, "everything is structured to protect these assets from any legal challenge. Your husband anticipated Jonathan might contest the will once he discovered the full scope of what was kept from him." That afternoon, I made another crucial call to Richard Sterling, a private investigator whose card I'd found in Robert's files. His credentials were impressive. Former FBI specializing in corporate investigations with a success rate that justified his premium fees. "Mrs. Campbell, Robert briefed me about potential family complications months ago. He suspected Jonathan might react poorly to discovering he'd been tested rather than simply rewarded." Within 48 hours, Richard had compiled a comprehensive report that both vindicated Robert's concerns and gave me significant leverage. Jonathan's financial situation was far more precarious than he'd let on. The penthouse came with $380,000 in annual maintenance fees and property taxes that would strain his liquid assets. His investment portfolio, while valuable on paper, was heavily weighted towards speculative tech stocks that had lost 40% of their value in recent months. More importantly, Richard had documented a pattern of behavior that showed Jonathan's true character. Recordings from building security cameras showing him berating service staff. Email threads where he dismissed charitable giving as throwing money at problems. Most damning, a conversation with his business partner where he'd laughed about finally getting the old man's money now that I don't have to pretend to care about his opinions anymore. But the most revealing discovery was Jonathan's immediate actions after the will reading. Rather than expressing concern about my welfare or offering to help me find alternative housing, he'd contacted interior designers within hours to begin renovating the penthouse. The man had literally scheduled the destruction of 42 years of marriage memories before I'd even finished packing my belongings. As I settled into a routine of strategic planning, Jonathan began leaving increasingly frustrated voicemails. His tone evolved from fake concern to entitled demand as days passed without contact. "Mom, this silent treatment is ridiculous. Aunt Helen says you haven't called her. Where are you staying? You can't just disappear like this." Then, "I've been going through Dad's papers and found references to additional investments. We need to discuss this. There might be accounts we don't know about." Finally, "This behavior is completely unlike you. People are asking questions. You're embarrassing the family." Each message revealed more about Jonathan's mindset. He wasn't concerned about my welfare. He was worried about assets he believed were rightfully his and frustrated by his inability to control the narrative. 2 weeks after discovering the garage, I was ready to make my next move. I'd established myself in the Carmel Cottage, a breathtaking property that exceeded even Robert's written descriptions. The ocean view home was designed with meticulous attention to my preferences, from the built-in bookshelves surrounding a stone fireplace to the garden filled with varieties of roses I'd always admired. More importantly, I'd assembled a team of professionals who understood both my situation and my objectives. Patricia had introduced me to Howard Blake, a financial advisor who'd worked secretly with Robert for years. Marcus had connected me with appraisers and auction specialists. Richard continued monitoring Jonathan's activities and growing desperation. The cottage even came with an unexpected ally, Margaret Winters, a neighbor who'd befriended Robert during his preparation visits. Over tea in my new kitchen, she filled in details that completed my understanding of Robert's planning. He was so careful about every detail, she explained. He'd bring photographs of your city home, trying to recreate elements that would comfort you. He said this place needed to feel like home immediately, because you might be vulnerable when you arrived. Margaret's own story. Surviving her husband's death 8 years earlier and rebuilding her life independently made her uniquely qualified to understand my situation. Robert mentioned he was protecting these preparations from potential interference. He didn't elaborate, but said you might need a friend who understood what it meant to start over. 3 weeks after the will reading, Jonathan's patience finally cracked. I was enjoying morning coffee in my garden when my phone rang with his number. "Mom, where the hell are you?" His voice carried none of his usual professional polish. "I hired a private investigator to find you. Do you have any idea how that looks? I had to tell people my elderly mother vanished after showing signs of confusion following Dad's death. The calculated manipulation of casting me as potentially incompetent to justify his invasive investigation struck like a physical blow. But I'd learned from Robert's strategic example, respond from strength, not emotion. "Hello, Jonathan. I'm taking time to process everything that's happened and make decisions about my future." "What decisions? What future? You're 68 years old with no income and apparently no fixed address. This fantasy of independence needs to end." The condescension in his voice was breathtaking. He still saw me as someone to be managed rather than respected. "I'm quite comfortable, thank you. In fact, I'm calling to invite you to visit me tomorrow. I think it's time we had a comprehensive discussion about recent events." The address I gave him clearly confused him. Carmel was hardly where he'd expect to find his supposedly destitute mother. Jonathan arrived at the cottage the next morning in his BMW, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm as he took in the property's obvious value. "This is interesting," he said, his business negotiation tone poorly concealing his growing anxiety. "Care to explain how you're suddenly living in a multi-million-dollar coastal estate?" I gestured him inside, letting him absorb the cottage's elegant interior before responding. His trained eye was clearly calculating values, comparing the reality before him to his assumptions about my circumstances. "Your father made provisions I wasn't aware of," I said simply. "The cottage was meant to be a surprise." "Like that mysterious garage in the industrial district?" Jonathan's voice hardened. "I visited it yesterday, saw enough through the windows to know there are vintage cars inside, cars worth considerably more than the penthouse Dad left me." So he'd discovered part of the truth. The question was how much he actually knew versus how much he suspected. "Let's discuss this properly," I said, leading him to the back patio where I'd prepared coffee and a light lunch. The setting was deliberately chosen, comfortable, private, with an ocean view that reinforced the reversal of our positions. "Before we talk about assets, I want to show you something." I handed him a leather portfolio containing selected documents, the maintenance assessments for the penthouse that Robert had commissioned 3 years earlier, anticipating the expensive systems failures Jonathan was now discovering. His face changed as he recognized the reports. The boring building assessment Dad kept bringing up at dinner, the one I told him was unnecessary expense. Robert wasn't being cautious. He was trying to prepare you for exactly what you're facing now. Jonathan set the portfolio aside, his jaw tightening. "If you've brought me here to deliver some posthumous, 'I told you so' from Dad—" "I haven't," I interrupted. "I'm establishing context for decisions I need to make going forward." Over the next hour, I walked Jonathan through the reality of his situation versus mine. His supposedly valuable inheritance came with crushing overhead costs he couldn't easily afford. The penthouse required immediate repairs that would consume most of his liquid assets. Meanwhile, I was sitting on carefully structured wealth that generated substantial passive income with minimal management requirements. "So what are you proposing?" he finally asked, his earlier arrogance replaced by wary calculation. "Nothing," I replied. "I'm not proposing anything. You came to me, remember? Making demands, hiring investigators, questioning my competence." The directness seemed to catch him off guard. Throughout our relationship, I'd been the accommodating one, smoothing conflicts, making excuses for his behavior. This version of me, calm, financially secure, unwilling to be managed, was clearly unfamiliar territory. "Look, if there are additional family assets, surely we should discuss how to handle them appropriately. As Dad's heirs..." "You received your inheritance, Jonathan. Robert's intentions regarding everything else were quite explicit." His expression darkened with the realization that I wasn't negotiating from weakness, but from a position of strength he'd completely misunderstood. "This is what Dad wanted, isn't it?" The bitter recognition finally dawned. Some kind of test. Some way to prove I deserved more than what he left me. I met his gaze directly. "What do you think he would have concluded based on your behavior since the will reading?" The question hung between us, sharp and unavoidable. Jonathan's treatment of me, the casual dismissal, the immediate disposal of our shared memories, the entitled assumption that I was now his responsibility to manage, had perfectly demonstrated the character flaws Robert had been concerned about. Jonathan left the cottage that afternoon without definitive answers, but with a clear understanding that every assumption he'd made about our relative positions needed revision. I had no intention of making his situation easy or comfortable. He'd tested my character with his cruelty. Now he could live with the consequences. Over the following months, I established myself in Carmel while Jonathan struggled with the reality of his inheritance. The penthouse, far from being the windfall he'd expected, became a financial burden. Emergency repairs to aging building systems consumed his savings. Property taxes and maintenance fees stressed his monthly budget. The investment portfolio's declining value in a volatile market made his situation increasingly precarious. Meanwhile, I flourished. The cottage became exactly the home Robert had envisioned, a place where I could entertain new friends, pursue interests I'd neglected during years of managing a husband's illness, and most importantly, make decisions based purely on my own preferences rather than anyone else's expectations. Marcus introduced me to other collectors, and I found unexpected pleasure in learning about automotive history and investment strategies. Patricia helped me establish a charitable foundation focused on financial literacy for older women, using my experience to help others avoid the vulnerability I might have faced without Robert's planning. Most satisfying was the gradual recognition within our social circle that I hadn't been victimized by Robert's will, but strategically protected by it. Friends who'd initially offered sympathy began seeking my advice on estate planning. The narrative Jonathan had tried to establish of an incompetent elderly woman requiring management crumbled as people witnessed my obvious competence and financial acumen. Jonathan's attempts to maintain appearances became increasingly strained. The penthouse renovations he'd begun so confidently stalled when contractor payments became problematic. His business ventures suffered as he focused on trying to uncover additional family assets that might relieve his financial pressure. 6 months after the will reading, reality finally forced Jonathan to confront the unsustainability of his situation. A reluctant phone call led to another meeting at the cottage, this one very different in tone from our previous encounter. He arrived looking genuinely haggard, his usual polished appearance replaced by someone clearly under financial stress. "I may have made some mistakes," he admitted, a stunning acknowledgement from someone who'd never previously admitted error. "What kind of mistakes?" I asked, maintaining the careful neutrality that had served me well. The penthouse situation is more complicated than I anticipated. The renovation costs, the carrying expenses, it's more than I can realistically manage long term. Over the next hour, Jonathan laid out his financial reality with unprecedented honesty. The glamorous inheritance had become a trap. His business ventures were faltering under the distraction. His marriage was strained by financial pressure and his obvious desperation to find additional family assets. "I'm not asking for charity," he said finally, "but I wonder if there might be some collaborative approach that honors Dad's wishes while acknowledging the practical realities we're both facing." It was the closest thing to an apology I was likely to receive, and more importantly, it suggested the beginning of genuine self-reflection rather than just financial expediency. "What are you actually proposing, Jonathan?" "Partnership, maybe. You clearly have resources and expertise I underestimated. I have business experience and family obligations Dad presumably wanted maintained. Perhaps we could find a structure that serves everyone's interests." I considered his proposal carefully. Robert's letter had given me discretion about sharing the inheritance if Jonathan demonstrated genuine character growth. 6 months of struggle had apparently begun that process, though whether the change was genuine or just desperation-driven remained unclear. "I'm willing to consider that," I said finally, "but any collaboration would have conditions." Jonathan nodded eagerly. "What conditions?" "Complete financial transparency, professional oversight of any funds I provide, and most importantly, acknowledgement of how you've treated me since your father's death." That last requirement clearly stung, but he didn't argue. "What kind of acknowledgement?" "Understanding that relationships have consequences, Jonathan. You can't dismiss someone as worthless and then expect their help when circumstances change." We talked for another 2 hours, outlining a possible structure that would address his immediate financial crisis while protecting the assets Robert had intended for my security. I would establish a trust that could prevent foreclosure on the penthouse and provide working capital for his business ventures. In return, he would accept professional financial management and commit to rebuilding the relationship his behavior had nearly destroyed. "This isn't charity," I made clear. "It's an investment in the possibility that you can become the man your father hoped you could be." Jonathan agreed to the terms, though whether from genuine remorse or financial necessity remained to be proven through his subsequent actions. A year after discovering the garage and its extraordinary contents, I reflected on the journey that had transformed both my circumstances and my relationship with my son. Robert's unconventional inheritance plan had initially seemed cruel in its apparent favoritism, but had ultimately achieved exactly what he'd intended: protection for me and a catalyst for Jonathan's character development. The garage key that had once seemed to represent my dismissal had unlocked not just physical assets, but a new understanding of my own worth and capabilities. The cars, the cottage, the investment portfolio, all were meaningful, but the real inheritance had been the confidence to demand respect and the financial independence to enforce those demands. Jonathan's transformation wasn't complete or perfect, but it was genuine. The financial crisis had forced him to confront patterns of entitlement and dismissiveness that had been growing for years. Our new relationship, built on mutual respect rather than assumed obligations, was stronger than what we'd lost. As I drove the Aston Martin along the coastal highway that evening, the car's powerful engine purring beneath me, I smiled thinking about Robert's final strategic masterstroke. He'd known exactly what both Jonathan and I needed: protection for me, accountability for him, and ultimately a path toward the family relationship we'd lost along the way. The useless old woman Jonathan had mocked now controlled assets worth over $30 million and had used that leverage to secure not just her own future, but a chance for her son to discover his better nature. Sometimes the most generous gifts come disguised as harsh lessons, and the greatest inheritance isn't money but the wisdom to use it well.